The silence in the courtroom was thick as fog on a cold morning. Margaret Thompson, seated in the front row, watched her son Ryan through eyes blurred by unshed tears. Her fingers twisted a damp white handkerchief, while her gaze anxiously alternated between her son's pale face and the stern expressions of the 12 jurors. The navy blue suit Ryan wore, carefully chosen for the trial, now seemed to weigh tons on his tense shoulders. The handcuffs on his wrists reflected the fluorescent lights of the courtroom, a constant and cruel reminder of his situation. By his side, Sarah Wells, his lawyer, maintained a firm posture, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her concern over the direction the trial was about to take. Prosecutor James Morrison rose with the confidence of one who had already convicted hundreds of criminals throughout his career. His impeccable grey suit and domineering stance emanated an authority that made several jurors shift in their seats, attentive to every word that was to come. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," his deep voice echoed through the room, "what we have before us today is not a case of doubt or circumstance. What we have is a premeditated murder, carried out with a brutality that even shocks the most seasoned investigators." Morrison strategically paused, his eyes scanning every face on the jury, establishing a silent connection before continuing. With measured steps, Morrison approached the projection screen set up in the courtroom. "The evidence we will present today is irrefutable," he declared, as images from the crime scene began to appear on the screen. The first photograph showed Professor Thomas Kane's apartment in complete disarray: overturned furniture, dark stains on the beige carpet, personal belongings scattered like macabre confetti from a deadly celebration. Maggie stifled a sob, and Ryan closed his eyes momentarily, his jaw tense under the strain of maintaining his composure. 3 of the jurors instinctively averted their gaze, while others leaned forward, absorbing every grim detail of the scene. "The defendant's DNA was found all over the victim's apartment," Morrison continued, his voice gaining intensity. "His fingerprints were uncovered not only on the murder weapon, a letter opener belonging to the victim himself, but also on various objects throughout the apartment. The building's security camera recorded his entry at 7:43 p.m. Precisely within the time frame, experts determined the crime had occurred. And most crucially, Ryan Thompson had a powerful motive for wanting Thomas Kane dead. Sarah Wells abruptly rose at this point, her firm voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is making allegations without presenting the proper evidence to support them." Judge Howard, a 60-year-old man with piercing eyes and deep wrinkles that marked years of difficult decisions, leaned forward in his chair. His stern gaze alternated between the defense attorney and the prosecutor before declaring, "Objection overruled. Proceed, Prosecutor Morrison, but stay within the bounds of evidence already processed." Sarah sank back into her chair, exchanging a worried look with Ryan, while Morrison allowed himself a small, satisfied smile before continuing his damning exposition. Morrison walked over to the evidence table, retrieving a sealed plastic bag containing a blood-stained letter opener. The once gleaming metal now displayed a darkened, sinister hue that made Margaret Thompson clutch her crucifix, hard enough to leave marks on her palm. The prosecutor raised the object, allowing the courtroom lights to reveal every detail of the murder weapon. This letter opener, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, was found next to Professor Kane's body. On it, we found not only the defendant's fingerprints, but also skin residue under the handle, skin that DNA testing proved belonged to Ryan Thompson. With every word from the prosecutor, Maggie felt her heart sink deeper into a pit of despair. The next piece of evidence presented was even more devastating. Morrison motioned to his assistant, who projected a sequence of security camera images onto the screen. "Please observe the timeline," his voice echoed through the room as he pointed to the timestamps in the corners of the images. 7:43 p.m. Ryan Thompson enters the building. 8:22 p.m. Ryan Thompson exits hastily, his suit, the same one he was wearing upon entry, now visibly disheveled. Sarah Wells scribbled furiously on her legal pad, but Maggie could see from the slight tremor in her hand that even the lawyer was shaken by the chronological precision of the evidence. A forensic expert took the witness stand. Dr. Patricia Cohen, a middle-aged woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a clinical expression. Her testimony was methodically devastating. "We found 23 stab wounds on the victim's body. The pattern analysis of the injuries indicates a right-handed assailant, approximately 6 feet in height. The defendant is right-handed and stands 6 feet, 1 inch tall. Maggie watched the jurors absorbing every word. An elderly woman shook her head in disapproval. A businessman in a suit took detailed notes. A young mother bit her lip nervously. Condemnation was forming in their eyes, and Maggie could feel it like an icy wave creeping up her spine. The prosecutor Morrison continued his relentless exposition, now focusing on the motive for the crime. Professor Kane had recently participated in a disciplinary meeting on campus, where both he and the accused taught. Witnesses will confirm that, after this meeting, Ryan Thompson was seen arguing heatedly with the victim in the faculty parking lot. Maggie squeezed her eyes shut, remembering that day. Her son had come home distraught but refused to talk about it. Now sitting in that stifling courtroom, she desperately wished she had insisted more, asked more questions, found a way to prevent things from reaching this point. The last piece of evidence presented was an email recovered from the victim's computer, sent just 2 days before the murder. Morrison read its contents with precise intonation, each word dropping like a hammer on Maggie's hopes. "Dear Principal, I hereby express my deep concern over Professor Thompson's behavior. Recent events lead me to believe that a more thorough investigation is necessary. The email was never sent. Thomas Kane was murdered before he could press the send button." Maggie watched her son, who kept his eyes fixed on a distant point, his expression a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. But she knew him too well. She could see the fear in the tense corners of his mouth, the slight tremor of his handcuffed hands on the table. The courtroom plunged into a sepulchral silence as Morrison presented his final considerations. Maggie Thompson barely breathed, her eyes fixed on her son's broad back. That same boy she had rocked so many nights, whom she had watched grow with such pride. The prosecutor's words seemed distant now, as if from another world, while a terrible certainty grew in her chest. Her son would be convicted. There was no escape from the meticulously presented evidence, the perfectly constructed narrative, the seemingly irrefutable proof pointing to Ryan as guilty. In her mind, painfully vivid images began to form. Ryan in an orange prison uniform, Ryan growing old behind bars, Ryan losing the best years of his life for something he hadn't done. Her hands, which had held the handkerchief as an anchor to reality for so long, now trembled with a different nervous energy. It was no longer fear, it was resolution. As she watched her son's tense face, she relived in a flash all the sacrifices she had made as a single mother. The sleepless nights, the 3 simultaneous jobs, the skipped meals so he could eat. This would be just one more sacrifice, she thought, perhaps the last and most important of all. The moment of decision came like a wave of absolute clarity. Maggie straightened in her seat, feeling every muscle in her body tense with iron determination. Her hands stopped trembling, and she tucked the handkerchief into her purse with a calmness she hadn't felt for weeks. In her mind, the details of that fateful night, details only she knew, began to organize themselves into a clear, precise narrative. She knew exactly what she needed to say, how she needed to say it, and more importantly, she knew she was the only person who could save her son. As Morrison continued his closing argument, Maggie Thompson made peace with her fate. Tomorrow, when the court reconvened, she would change everything. Her son would live, and this thought was all the comfort she needed to face what was to come. The next day, the heavy courthouse doors burst open with a bang that made everyone in their seats jump. Margaret Thompson stormed through, a force of nature, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor like thunder. The court officer, taken by surprise, barely had time to react before she crossed the barrier, separating the gallery from the restricted area. Her grey hair, usually neatly styled, was disheveled, and her eyes blazed with a fierce determination that utterly transformed her usual retired teacher appearance. "Stop this at once." Her voice cracked like a whip, overpowering Prosecutor Morrison's argument mid-sentence. Judge Howard immediately banged his gavel, the sound reverberating through the room. "Mrs. Thompson, this is an outrage. Remove yourself immediately, or you will be held in contempt." But Maggie pressed forward, ignoring the protests and rising commotion. Ryan, still handcuffed in his chair, looked at his mother with an expression of horror and disbelief, as if he didn't recognize the woman who had raised him. Sarah Wells rose abruptly, knocking over her file of documents in the process. Pages of meticulously organized evidence scattered like leaves in the wind, but no one moved to retrieve them. Two security officers stepped toward Maggie, but something in her bearing made them hesitate. There was an aura of inevitability about her movements, as if she were a force of nature that could not be stopped. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. Jurors whispered among themselves, some leaning forward in their seats for a better view of the unfolding scene. Photographers covering the trial snapped away frantically, capturing every surreal second. Morrison, recovering from the initial shock, took a step toward the judge. "Your Honor, I request a recess to—" But Maggie cut him off again, her voice now carrying an authority that silenced the entire room. "There will be no recess," she declared, reaching the center of the courtroom floor. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steely. "I cannot allow this charade to continue for another minute." Ryan tried to rise, but the officer at his side kept him seated, with a firm hand on his shoulder. "Mom, no," he began, but the words died in his throat when he saw the look on her face. Judge Howard, with 50 years on the bench, had never witnessed anything like this. His normally stern eyes now showed a mixture of irritation and curiosity. He raised the gavel again, but something in Maggie's stance made him hesitate. She was now standing directly in the center of the room, like an actress taking the stage for her final performance. "Mrs. Thompson," the judge spoke, his voice a blend of authority and caution, "this is your last chance to remove yourself before I am forced to take drastic measures." Maggie lifted her chin, her eyes meeting the judge's with an intensity that made the man shift in his seat. The silence that followed was as heavy as lead, broken only by the distant wail of sirens outside and the low whir of camera shutters. The entire courtroom held its breath, awaiting the next act in this unexpected drama unfolding before their eyes. "I killed Thomas Kane." Maggie Thompson's words fell like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of shock across the courtroom. Ryan went pale instantly, his handcuffs clinking as his hands began to tremble. Judge Howard leaned forward in his chair, his brow furrowed in utter bewilderment. In the jury box, 12 faces registered varying degrees of astonishment, from gaping mouths to eyes wide with disbelief. "It happened exactly as the prosecutor described," Maggie continued, her voice growing stronger now as if each word liberated her from an immense weight. "But it wasn't Ryan who entered that apartment at 7:43 p.m. It was me. I was wearing my son's coat and hat, which I had borrowed from his closet that morning." Sarah Wells let out a muffled exclamation, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table hard enough to whiten her knuckles. Morrison, for his part, remained as still as a statue, his face a mask of confusion and skepticism. Maggie began pacing slowly across the courtroom floor, her heels echoing in the tomb-like silence. "I had discovered that Thomas Kane was planning to destroy my son's career. He had compiled a dossier with false harassment allegations, fabricated documents, manipulated testimonies." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on, looking directly at the jurors. "I confronted him at his apartment. I showed him I had proof of his manipulation, threatened to expose his own inappropriate conduct with students. He laughed. He laughed and said no one would believe me." Ryan let out a strangled sound, something between a sob and a protest. "Mom, no. Please." But Maggie continued, as if each word was a piece of a puzzle that needed to be completed. "Kane was furious when he realized I had copies of his incriminating emails. He tried to stop me from leaving. There was a struggle." She closed her eyes for a moment, reliving the scene. The letter opener was on the table. "When he lunged to grab me, I just reacted." An older juror brought her hand to her chest, her eyes moist. Another juror slowly shook his head, as if trying to process each word. Prosecutor Morrison finally moved, taking a step forward. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt by a mother to save her son. There is no evidence to corroborate this fanciful story." Maggie turned to him with surprising calm. "The gardening gloves I wore that night are still at the bottom of my greenhouse, stained with blood. Ryan's coat I put on is hidden in a box in the attic, along with the hat. And if you check the campus cameras on that day, you'll see Ryan was teaching phys ed class at the exact time of the crime. Dozens of students can confirm." Her voice no longer trembled. Each word carried the weight of undeniable truth. Judge Howard recovered from his initial shock, his voice thundering through the courtroom. Mrs. Thompson, are you aware that you have just confessed to a homicide in open court? Maggie nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. Yes, Your Honor. And I can prove every word I said. Ryan finally managed to stand up, ignoring the officer's protests beside him. No, Mom, you can't do this. I won't let you. Tears streamed freely down his face, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah Wells tried simultaneously to soothe her client and process the devastating implications of this new revelation. I can describe every moment of that night, Maggie continued, her voice now softer, more distant, as if reliving every detail. The sound of glass breaking as we knocked over the coffee table, the way the lamplight flickered, making shadows dance on the walls, the smell of spilled coffee mingled with blood. She paused, her eyes finding her son's. I did what any mother would do to protect her child, and I'd do it all over again. The courtroom was utterly silent, every person there absorbing the weight of that unexpected confession. The photographers had stopped taking pictures, as if afraid to break the tension of the moment with the sound of their flashes. Morrison was frantically flipping through his notes, looking for something that could contradict this new version of events. Judge Howard removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if trying to wake from a particularly disturbing dream. The silence that followed Maggie Thompson's confession had a weight of its own, heavy and suffocating. It was as if the very air of the courtroom had frozen, suspending every breath, every movement, every unfinished thought. Ryan's tears flowed silently down his face, creating dark stains on his immaculate suit. His shoulders shook with contained sobs as his eyes begged his mother to deny it all, to say it was just a nightmare they would all awake from. Sarah Wells remained motionless, her legal mind trying to process the implications of this extraordinary turn of events. Her hands hovered over her document folder, but she knew nothing in her extensive preparation could have braced her for this moment. Prosecutor Morrison alternated his gaze between his meticulous notes and Maggie's upright figure, as if searching them for some rational explanation for what had just happened. On the jury bench, the reactions were a mosaic of human emotions in their rawest form. A young juror cried openly, her face buried in her hands. Next to her, a middle-aged executive who had remained stoic throughout the trial now had watery eyes. An elderly lady clutched her crucifix tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. A mother's love, in its most brutal and sacrificial form, had touched something deep within each of them. Judge Howard finally broke the silence, his normally thunderous voice now reduced to little more than a hoarse whisper. Officers, detain Ms. Thompson. Two policemen approached hesitantly, as if afraid to touch the woman who had just demonstrated the depths of maternal love. Maggie extended her wrists with serene dignity, her eyes never leaving her son's face. No. Ryan's scream echoed through the courtroom walls, breaking the spell of silence. He tried to rise, struggling against his own shackles, against the officer restraining him, against the reality unfolding before him. Mom, please, don't do this. I can't let you. Judge Howard banged his gavel once, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. This session is adjourned, he declared, his voice regaining some of its authority. The court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 o'clock to... He paused, adjusting his glasses with slightly trembling fingers, to re-evaluate all evidence in light of this new development. As the officers led Maggie toward the exit, she kept her head held high, her steps firm and rhythmic, echoing on the cold courtroom floor. Though she seemed smaller, almost swallowed by the orange jumpsuit, there was something about her bearing that emanated an unshakable dignity, as if carrying that burden was somehow a personal victory. Her eyes, fixed ahead, did not waver, but the glint in them betrayed her contained pain. Behind her, Ryan called out for his mother, his voice choked by sobs that grew in intensity. Mom, please. Sarah Wells, visibly shaken, gripped Ryan's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort that seemed unable to reach the depths of his anguish. Detective Marcus Chen spread crime scene photos across his desk as he listened to Margaret Thompson's confession recording for the third time. Beside him, a stack of forensic reports awaited review. Something about the confession nagged at him. The details were too precise to be fabricated, too specific to be just the ravings of a desperate mother. Play that part about the lamp again, he requested his assistant controlling the recording. The lamp kept flickering as we struggled, making shadows dance on the walls. Maggie's recorded voice echoed through the silent room. Chen consulted the initial crime scene report. Indeed, the techs had noted and photographed a lamp with faulty wiring, a minor detail that had not been released to the press. Only the killer could know that specific detail. Next door, crime scene investigator Sandra Martinez re-examined the physical evidence with fresh eyes. The bloodstain patterns on the carpet told a different story now. The attacker's height, we assumed. We were looking for someone Ryan's size, but if the person was wearing heels, she scribbled calculations on her notepad, adjusting the variables. The new analysis started to make sense. Prosecutor Morrison entered the room carrying a thick folder. "We found something interesting on the campus cameras," he announced, his voice tense. "Ryan Thompson was actually teaching at the time of the murder. 27 students confirmed his presence. He tossed several signed statements onto the table. How did we miss this before?" The frustration in his voice was palpable. Chen stood up, approaching the board where crime scene photos were pinned. "And there's more," he said, pointing to one specific image. "You see these marks on the door frame? We assumed they were Ryan's height, but..." He picked up the forensic report. "If the person was wearing heels, the height matches Maggie Thompson's exactly." Morrison shook his head, still resistant. "But what about the DNA, the fingerprints on the letter opener?" Martinez interjected, holding up a report. "I just re-examined the samples. The DNA under the victim's nails. There are traces that could belong to a woman. At the time, they were dismissed as contamination, but now..." Her voice trailed off as she flipped through more test results. On Chen's desk, Maggie's confession recording continued to play. Every detail she mentioned found corroboration in the reports, every element of her story fitting like puzzle pieces that had been forced into the wrong places before. The truth was emerging not through new evidence, but a new perspective on the old. The investigators found the greenhouse exactly as Maggie had described. At the back of a dusty shelf, behind broken pots and rusted tools, was a pair of gardening gloves carefully folded inside a plastic bag. Martinez examined them closely, noting the darkened stains covering the material. "Positive for blood," she announced after the preliminary test. "And look at this." She pointed to a small tear near the right thumb. She mentioned the glove tearing during the struggle, too specific a detail to be made up. In the Thompsons' attic, hidden under a pile of old Christmas boxes, they found another crucial piece of evidence, Ryan's coat, still bearing microscopic traces of the crime. "She kept the evidence," Chen murmured, examining the garment. "Didn't destroy it, as if part of her knew she would one day need to prove the truth." The hat was there too, neatly folded in tissue paper, like a macabre relic of maternal sacrifice. Morrison, who had been following the discoveries with growing unease, received a new report from the technical team. "Kane's cell phone records have been recovered," he said, his voice tense. "We found a series of deleted messages." He was indeed planning to ruin Ryan's career. He passed the printouts to Chen, who examined them carefully. The messages revealed a pattern of predatory behavior, manipulation, and veiled threats. The forensic team re-examined Kane's apartment with a fresh perspective. In the kitchen, they found traces of spilled coffee exactly where Maggie had described. The coffee had sweetener, Martinez confirmed, consulting the analyses. She mentioned that Kane always used artificial sweetener in his coffee, another detail that wasn't in the public reports. The most compelling evidence came from the campus surveillance records. "Look at this," Chen pointed to a sequence of images. 15 minutes before the time of the crime, Maggie appears in the faculty parking lot. She's wearing an oversized coat. Morrison leaned over the images, his initial resistance melting away in the face of the irrefutable evidence. "And here," Chen continued, advancing the video, "she leaves 50 minutes later. The coat is stained, and she's keeping her hands in her pockets." A previously overlooked witness provided the final confirmation. The building's doorman, re-interviewed after the confession, recalled a crucial detail. "I thought it was strange at the time," he said. "The person who entered was wearing a low hat and an oversized coat. I thought it was Professor Thompson, but the gait was different, more hesitant." He paused, the memory crystallizing. "And there was a perfume. Jasmine flowers. The same one I smelled when Mrs. Thompson came earlier that week looking for Professor Kane." In the forensics lab, The analysis of fibers found at the crime scene revealed another confirmation. The fibers don't just match the coat, Martinez explained. We found residues of pollen and garden soil in the same samples. Maggie mentioned that she had been working in her garden that afternoon before putting on her son's coat. Chen organized all the new evidence on his board, connecting the dots with red string. Every detail from Maggie's confession found material corroboration. The spilled coffee, the faulty lamp, the specific tear in the glove, the jasmine perfume. No liar could fabricate so many precise details, he concluded, and every new piece of evidence we uncover confirms her story. Detective Chen held the recovered pen drive from Thomas Kane's office as if it were a bomb about to explode. The forensic technology team had just decrypted its contents, revealing a file that would change everything. The recording from the personal security camera that Kane kept hidden in his apartment. A camera that no one knew existed until Maggie mentioned in her confession that Kane always boasted about his particular surveillance system. In the evidence room, Chen, Morrison, and Martinez watched the screen in absolute silence. The recording showed the exact moment of the crime, captured in high definition. The figure who entered the apartment wore Ryan's coat and hat, but the way of walking was unmistakably feminine. Kane appeared in the frame, visibly altered. The discussion began. There was no sound, but body language said it all. Kane advanced threateningly, the figure retreated. Then, in a quick motion, he grabbed the hat, revealing for a split second Maggie Thompson's face before the struggle began. "My God," Morrison whispered, dropping heavily into a chair. She was telling the truth all along. Martinez paused the video, zooming in on Maggie's face. The expression in her eyes was one of pure maternal terror, not the fury of a murderer, but the desperation of a mother protecting her child. Chen kept watching as the scene unfolded. The fight, the spilled coffee, the flickering lampshade, every detail exactly as Maggie had described. "And here's the ultimate proof," he pointed out. In the top corner of the screen, a digital clock showed 7:45. Ryan Thompson was teaching class at this exact moment. 27 students confirmed his presence in the gym. The recording ended with Maggie stumbling out of the frame, clearly in shock. Kane lay motionless on the floor, the letter opener fallen beside him. The clock read 8:15. "It's over," Chen declared, turning off the monitor. "There are no more doubts. Margaret Thompson is Thomas Kane's killer. And Ryan Thompson is completely innocent." Morrison gathered his papers with trembling hands, the sound of the sheets echoing in the silence of the room. Years of experience as a prosecutor had not prepared him for this moment, when the truth revealed itself so different from the narrative he had so carefully constructed. He took a deep breath before muttering, "I need to speak with the judge immediately," his voice hoarse, laden with urgency. "And with the defense, Ryan Thompson needs to be released today." His eyes fixed on the table before him, but his mind was already working rapidly, thinking of the next steps and the devastating implications of that unexpected twist. Ryan Thompson sat on the edge of his cell bed, the release papers still in his trembling hands. Cleared of all charges, but the price of that freedom weighed on his chest like liquid lead. The official document's words blurred before his eyes. In light of conclusive new evidence, he couldn't read on. His mother, his own mother, had killed Thomas Kane. The last rays of sun streamed through the bars, casting shadows that reminded him of the bars that would now confine his mother. Ryan closed his eyes, but the images wouldn't stop coming. Maggie in her garden, tending her roses so lovingly. Maggie grading schoolwork late into the night. Maggie serving coffee in their favorite mugs on Sunday mornings. How to reconcile those memories with the truth he now knew? He rose abruptly, beginning to gather his few belongings. Each motion was mechanical, as if his body operated on autopilot, while his mind navigated a turbulent sea of conflicting emotions. Guilt and relief waged war in his chest. Guilt that his freedom had cost his mother's, relief at finally understanding why she had been so odd in the days following Kane's death. The guard appeared to release Ryan, but he barely registered the checkout procedure. In his mind, he replayed every moment of the past months, searching for signs he should have noticed. The way she avoided talking about the case, how her hands shook reading the news about the murder, how she spent hours in the garden, not tending flowers, he now realized, but hiding evidence. In the prison corridor, his steps echoed hollowly. Each step took him further from the bars that had confined him, but brought him closer to a truth that felt even more suffocating than imprisonment. His mother had killed a man, his gentle mother, who wouldn't even kill spiders in the bathroom, preferring to catch them carefully and release them in the garden. His mother had taken a life to save his. The officer returned his personal effects, and Ryan held his graduation ring a moment too long. It had been a gift from her, bought with months of saving from her teacher's salary. "So you'll never forget how much you can achieve," she'd said. Now those words took on a new, bittersweet meaning. How far would a mother go to protect her child's dreams? Sarah Wells waited for him at the exit, but Ryan could barely meet her gaze. How to thank someone for helping prove your innocence when it meant condemning your own mother? The words stuck in his throat, along with all the questions he didn't know if he'd have the courage to ask. Why? How long had she known about Kane? What really happened that night? The prison visitors' room was empty except for Ryan and his mother. Maggie Thompson wore the orange jumpsuit as if it were one of her old floral dresses, with unwavering dignity. Her hands, once always busy with schoolbooks or gardening tools, now rested quiet on the metal table. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken words. "Why, Mom?" Ryan's voice came out harsher than he intended. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me be accused for so long?" His hands trembled on the table, and he clenched them into fists to try to control the emotion. Maggie extended her hand as if to touch her son, but stopped halfway. "He was going to destroy you, Ryan. He had an entire dossier of lies, fabricated accusations. Kane was obsessed, determined to ruin your career, your life." She took a deep breath, decades of maternal instinct battling the need to reveal the whole truth. "When I confronted him that night, I showed him proof of his manipulations. I thought it would be enough to make him back down. But it wasn't," Ryan completed, his voice barely containing the anguish. "What happened, Mom? I need to know the whole truth." Maggie's eyes drifted to some distant point, reliving that night. He laughed when I showed him the evidence. "Said no one would believe me, that he had enough connections to ensure you'd never work in any school again." Her hands started trembling slightly. When I tried to leave, he became furious. "He grabbed my arm with force, said horrible things about you, about how he would enjoy destroying your life piece by piece." Ryan watched every expression on his mother's face, trying to understand how that woman who raised him alone, who always preached against violence, had reached this point. Maggie continued, her voice now almost a whisper. The letter opener was there on the table when he advanced. "It was instinct, Ryan. Maternal instinct. I didn't think, I just reacted. And afterwards, the question came out as a breath. Why keep the evidence? Why not destroy it?" A sad smile crossed Maggie's face. "Because I knew one day the truth would need to come out. I couldn't let you pay for something I did. I kept everything. Waiting, fearing the moment it would be necessary. But you let me be arrested, Mum." The pain in Ryan's voice was palpable. "You let me think my life was over." "Every day you spent in that cell killed me inside," Maggie replied, tears finally escaping her eyes. "But I'd rather wait for the right moment than risk a rash confession no one would believe. I needed to make sure that when I spoke, I had a way to prove it. For you, Ryan, always for you." Ryan rose abruptly, walking to the barred window. The afternoon sun cast shadows on the walls, reminding him of the bars of his own cell. "You know what's worse, Mom?" His voice was choked. "I understand why you did it, and I hate myself for understanding." Maggie remained seated, watching her son's tense back. "I don't regret it," she said with surprising firmness. "If I had to do it all over again to protect you, I would. That's what mothers do, protect their children no matter the cost." Ryan turned, facing his mother with teary eyes. In her prison uniform, she looked smaller, frailer, but her eyes held the same strength as always. The strength that raised him, that protected him, that now led her to accept the consequences of her final act of protection. Ryan stared at his mother for a long moment, before finally uttering the words he had kept for so long. "I saw you that night, Mum." The confession fell between them like a thunderbolt, freezing Maggie in place. "I was there, in the parking lot. I saw you enter the building wearing my coat." Maggie's face paled, her hands gripping the edge of the metal table. "But how? Why?" The words came trembling from her lips. "I got a message from Kane that afternoon. He wanted to meet me, said he had something important to discuss. Ryan ran his hands over his face, years of pent-up tension finally finding release. When I arrived, I saw you entering. I recognized your gait even with my coat. I waited in the car, panicked, not knowing what to do. Silent tears began to stream down Maggie's face as Ryan continued. When you left, I realized something terrible had happened. Your hands were shaking. There were stains on your coat. I drove home and waited for you to arrive, but I couldn't confront you. How could I? You've always been my protector, my safe haven. Why didn't you say anything during the trial? Maggie's voice was just a whisper. Why did you let things go so far? Ryan leaned forward, his voice intense. For the same reason you kept the evidence instead of destroying it. You were protecting me, but you were also protecting me from having to choose between lying under oath or condemning my own mother. So you let them accuse you. Maggie covered her mouth with her hands, realizing the extent of her son's sacrifice. It was easier to be wrongly accused than to be forced to testify against you. Ryan reached out, finally touching his mother's hand. I preferred to bear the guilt of a crime I didn't commit than to bear the guilt of condemning you. The silence that followed was charged with mutual understanding. Mother and son, sitting face to face, seemed to share a dialogue that dispensed with words. Maggie kept her hands firmly interlocked on the table, as if trying to contain the flood of emotions that threatened to overflow. Ryan, on the other hand, leaned slightly forward, his elbows resting on the cold metal, his gaze fixed on his mother's face. Every line of expression, every small movement of hers seemed to tell a story he was only beginning to understand. Both had carried secrets like shields, each trying to protect the other from the weight of the truth. Now exposed, the truth was both painful and liberating. Maggie broke the silence with a deep sigh. I didn't expect it to be easy, she said, her voice low but steady. But maybe now we can move forward even if the paths are different. Ryan nodded, the weight of acceptance visible in his eyes. 2 weeks before the murder, Maggie was organizing old class photos in her office when a student knocked on her door. Emily Parker, 19, visibly trembled as she held a brown envelope. Mrs. Thompson, I need to show you something about Professor Kane. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely open the envelope. He's been doing this to several students. The envelope contained dozens of messages, all captured in screenshots. Kane using his position to pressure students, offering grades in exchange for private meetings, threatening those who rejected him. Maggie felt her stomach churn as she read. Emily continued, her voice almost a whisper. When your son, Professor Ryan, started noticing something strange and questioning some of Professor Kane's behavior, he became furious. Maggie spent the following days investigating discreetly. The evidence piled up, more messages, whispered testimonies in the hallways, patterns of behavior impossible to ignore. Then one rainy afternoon, as she searched for more proof in the university system, she found something that chilled her blood. A digital folder titled Thompson Evidence, Password Protected. Using her old teacher credentials and years of experience with school systems, Maggie managed to access the files. What she found left her horrified. Kane had meticulously constructed a false dossier against Ryan. Manipulated photos, edited conversations, forged testimonies, all created to suggest improper behavior with students. There was even a draft email addressed to the university board, ready to destroy her son's career. In his private office, Kane kept a digital diary where he detailed his plans. Thompson is getting too curious, read a recent entry. Needs to be eliminated before he finds out more. I have everything prepared. A well-constructed accusation and no one will question it. After all, who would believe a physical education teacher against a respected researcher? Maggie printed everything with trembling hands. Each page revealed more of the web of manipulation and threats Kane had woven. In a separate folder, she found evidence that he had already destroyed other careers the same way. Professors and staff who had dared to question his methods or get too close to the truth. The night before the crime, Maggie found Kane's final email to Ryan. Tomorrow, 8 o'clock, my apartment. We have important matters to discuss about your future at the institution. The words were polite, but the implied threat was as clear as crystal. It was at that moment that Maggie Thompson, retired teacher and devoted mother, decided she needed to act before it was too late. Maggie adjusted Ryan's coat on her shoulders as she climbed the stairs to Kane's building. The weight of the evidence in her bag seemed to increase with every step. Dozens of student testimonies, screenshots of threatening messages, the false dossier against Ryan, all the proof of Kane's calculated cruelty. When Kane opened the door, his arrogant smile faltered as he saw Maggie instead of Ryan. "Mrs. Thompson, what are you doing here?" His gaze registered the oversized coat she was wearing, and a shadow of understanding crossed his face. "I know everything, Thomas." Maggie entered without waiting for an invitation, taking the evidence from her bag. "About the students, about your threats, about your plans against my son." She threw the printed pages onto the coffee table. Kane picked up a random sheet, his face hardening as he recognized his own file. "So it was you who broke into my computer?" He laughed, a cold and humorless sound. "You know that's a crime, don't you? Invasion of privacy, unauthorized access." He began methodically tearing the pages. "Your word against mine, Maggie. Who do you think they'll believe?" "I have copies of everything," Maggie replied, her voice trembling slightly. "And I'm not alone. Your victims are ready to speak." She took out more documents from her bag. "Emily Parker, Sarah Martinez, Jennifer Walsh, they've all kept evidence, Thomas. All ready to expose you." Kane's smile vanished completely. "You have no idea what game you're playing, Margaret." He moved closer, his voice lowering to a threatening whisper. "Your precious Ryan, so dedicated to his students, so concerned for their well-being. It would be a shame if evidence surfaced, suggesting that concern had other motives, wouldn't it? Don't you dare threaten my son." Maggie's voice came out cold as steel. "It's over, Thomas. Your manipulations, your threats, it's all over." Kane threw his head back and laughed. "Over? This is just beginning." He walked to his computer. "Want to see what I have prepared for your son?" His fingers flew over the keyboard. Photos, conversations, testimonies, all perfectly constructed. "When I'm done, Ryan will never set foot in a classroom again." Maggie asked, her voice breaking. "Why? Why do this to him?" "Because he was getting too close," Kane growled. "Asking questions, noticing patterns. Your boy too righteous, too moral. People like that are dangerous, Margaret. They need to be eliminated before they cause trouble." He suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Maggie's arm with brutal force. "Now I'll show you exactly what happens to people who try to expose me." Maggie struggled, knocking a coffee cup over the scattered papers. The nearby lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the ensuing scuffle, furniture was overturned, papers flew. Kane was stronger, but Maggie fought with the desperate strength of a mother. As he shoved her against the table, her hand found the letter opener. The cold metal against her palm seemed to awaken something primal inside her, the instinct of a mother to protect her child at any cost. "You're not going to destroy my son," Maggie stated, her voice eerily calm. The letter opener found its way between Kane's ribs once, then again, and again. Each blow carried years of pent-up fury, of helplessness in the face of witnessed injustices, of fear for her only child's future. Ryan sat alone in Sarah Wells's office, the evidence spread over the table like pieces of a macabre puzzle. Kane's recovered computer files, now retrieved by forensics, told a story that made his stomach churn. Doctored photos of him with students, edited conversations, forged testimonies, a meticulously woven web of lies designed to destroy him. "My God, Mother," he whispered, running his hands over his face as he read the draft email Kane had planned to send to the university board. The document detailed accusations so convincing, so well constructed, that even Ryan, knowing them to be false, felt a chill of fear reading them. Kane hadn't just planned to end his career, he intended to destroy his entire life. The messages recovered from Kane's cell phone revealed his growing obsession. "Thompson is becoming a problem," one note said. "Too righteous, too watchful. People like that are dangerous. I need to eliminate him before he finds out more." Ryan felt a lump in his throat as he realized that his concern over Kane's suspicious behavior with the students had sealed his sentence. His mother had discovered all of this before him. She had seen the danger approaching and acted in the only way she found to protect him. The conflict that resulted in Kane's death was not just a moment of rage. It was the climax of a battle between a mother's despair and a predator's calculated cruelty. "She knew," Ryan murmured, a sudden understanding hitting him like a wave. She knew that even if I beat the false accusations, the shadow of doubt would follow me forever. In a system that often protected the powerful, Kane would have won even in losing. The stain on his reputation would be indelible. Ryan stood up, walking slowly to the small office window, each step heavy as if carrying the weight of all the revelations of the past few months. The sun was setting over the city, pouring vibrant shades of red, orange, and gold into the horizon. The colors seemed to reflect the turmoil of emotions within him: anger, sadness, relief, and above all, a deep and unbreakable love for his mother. He leaned his hands on the metal windowsill, feeling its chill under his fingers as his gaze drifted into the ever-changing sky. His mother's last words at the trial echoed in his mind, reverberating with an almost painful clarity. "I did what any mother would do." Before, those words had sounded simple, but now, with the weight of understanding, he saw their depth. It was not just an act of protection, it was an act of sacrifice, of desperate justice. His mother had not acted on impulse nor out of hatred. She had chosen to stain her own hands because she could not bear to see her son destroyed by carefully constructed lies. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the gentle breeze coming through the half-open window to touch his face. He remembered all the times his mother had protected him as a child, when she had faced teachers who treated him unfairly, when she worked overtime to ensure he had what he needed, when she consoled him after every little defeat in life. And now this final, desperate, and irrevocable act was the culmination of all the love she had given him over the years. As he opened his eyes again, Ryan saw the sky differently. The blood red that once seemed like a wound now appeared as a sign of rebirth, that the darkness he and his mother had faced was finally beginning to give way to light. Morrison organized the evidence on his board, now with a completely different narrative. The same photos, the same forensic reports, but the story they told had changed drastically. Where he had once seen Ryan's guilt, he now found traces of a mother's despair. The evidence was there all along, he said to his gathered team. The jasmine perfume in the hallway, the high heel marks on the carpet, the attacker's height calculated without considering shoes. We were so focused on proving the son's guilt that we ignored the signs pointing to the mother. The prosecutor adjusted the timeline on the board. The sequence of events now made more sense. Maggie discovering Kane's plans, the confrontation at the apartment, the struggle that ended in tragedy. The messages recovered from Kane's computer were particularly disturbing. They revealed a predator who used his position of power to manipulate and threaten. Kane was not the innocent victim we thought, Morrison continued, pinning up prints of the threatening messages. He was a manipulator who planned to destroy Ryan Thompson's career with false accusations. Maggie discovered his plans and tried to protect her son. The team watched in silence as Morrison reconstructed the crime scene. The letter opener, the gardening gloves, the borrowed coat, each piece now fit into a different puzzle. It was no longer a story of premeditated murder, but of a desperate mother trying to save her son from calculated destruction. "For the first time in my career," Morrison concluded, his voice laden with a mixture of admiration and sorrow, "I have to admit that we pursued the wrong suspect. And now we have to decide how to proceed with a mother who committed a crime to protect her son from an even greater injustice." The prison gates opened for Ryan Thompson on a grey autumn morning. His personal belongings fit in a single cardboard box, some books, photos, letters his mother had sent during his detention. Now, those same letters carried a different weight, each word written by hands that had taken a life to protect him. As Ryan walked to freedom, in another prison complex, Maggie Thompson was being processed and photographed. Her fingerprints recorded, no longer as a visitor, but as an inmate. The orange jumpsuit swallowed her slight frame, but her posture remained upright, dignified. "Full name?" the officer asked. "Margaret Ann Thompson," she replied, her voice as steady as it had always been in classrooms. Sarah Wells coordinated the two processes simultaneously. In court, she presented the final documents for Ryan's release, while her team prepared Maggie's initial defense. The evidence that had saved the son now condemned the mother, an irony that did not go unnoticed by anyone involved in the case. "Your personal belongings need to be catalogued," the prison officer informed Maggie. An old wedding ring, a watch given by Ryan on his last birthday, a keychain with his childhood photo, each item a memory of the son she had fought so hard to protect. Maggie handed over each one with steady hands, though her eyes betrayed her contained emotion. In the parking lot of the men's prison, Ryan found his empty house waiting for him. The keys felt strange in his hands after so long. Inside the car, his mother's jasmine perfume still lingered, the same scent that had been one of the evidence of her presence at the crime scene. He started the engine, but couldn't drive away immediately, overwhelmed by the reality of his situation. At the women's prison, Maggie was led to her cell. The corridor seemed endless, each step echoing with finality. "Thompson, this will be your home for the next few months until the trial," the guard explained. Maggie surveyed the confined space, a narrow bed, a sink, a small desk. So different from her classroom, her garden, the spaces she had inhabited her entire life. "Mom," Ryan whispered to the steering wheel, tears finally escaping. In her cell, as if hearing her son's call, Maggie touched the cold wall and allowed herself a moment of weakness, a single tear rolling down her cheek. News of the prisoner swap circulated through the courthouse corridors. Staff who had witnessed Maggie's dramatic confession now whispered about the case's twist. Prosecutor Morrison, in his office, reviewed the paperwork one last time. His signature would free a man and seal another's fate, or rather that of a mother who had done the unthinkable out of love. Sarah Wells found Ryan in the parking lot, still paralyzed behind the wheel. "She's okay," she assured him, knowing exactly where her client's thoughts were. "She's strong, always has been." Ryan nodded, unable to form words. The lawyer placed a folder on his lap, the official documents of his release, his innocence finally proven. The price of that freedom, however, weighed more than any sentence he could have served. The prison's visitors' room was empty except for them. Ryan watched his mother across the metal table, noting how the orange uniform could not diminish her natural dignity. Maggie smiled that smile he had known since childhood, the same one she gave when he scraped his knee and needed to be brave. "You've lost weight," she said, reaching her hand across the table. "You need to eat better now that you're back home." Her words were so ordinary, so motherly, that for a moment it almost seemed they were in their kitchen, having one of their Sunday conversations. Ryan held her hand, noticing how cold it was. "Home isn't the same without you, Mom. The garden." His voice failed him. The garden, once so well tended, was now abandoned, the roses withering without Maggie's dedicated care. "The roses will survive," she said softly. "They're more resilient than they seem. Like us." Her eyes met her son's, conveying strength and acceptance. "Don't blame yourself, Ryan. Every choice I made was mine, and I'd do it all over again." "I'll wait for you," he promised, squeezing her hand. "I'll keep everything exactly as you left it. Your room, your flowers, your books." Maggie gently shook her head. "No, my son. You need to move on. Rebuild your life again. Go back to teaching. Do what you love." She paused, carefully choosing her words. "Cain cannot win, cannot stop us from living even now. How can I simply move on, knowing that you're here because of me?" "I'm here because of my choices," she corrected him firmly. "Choices I would make again if I had to. A mother protects her children. It's the oldest law in the world." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "My sentence will be lighter, knowing you're free, living, making a difference in your students' lives." Ryan swallowed hard, fighting back his own tears. "I promise to make you proud, Mom." "I've always been proud," she replied, her smile now brighter through the tears. "From the very first moment I held you in my arms. And I'm even more proud now, seeing your strength, your dignity through this whole nightmare." The guard announced that time was up. Mother and son rose simultaneously, their hands still joined across the cold table. "Until next Sunday," said Ryan, his voice steady despite the emotion. "Until Sunday," Maggie agreed, "and Ryan..." She squeezed his hand one last time. "Plant new roses. The garden needs new life." As she watched her son walk away, Maggie kept the smile on her face, even as the weight of the moment tightened around her chest. Each of Ryan's steps toward the door seemed a cruel reminder of the time that would still separate them, but she refused to let him see that. Her eyes followed him until the very last instant, taking in every detail. The way he held the folder with the papers he'd shown her, the way he adjusted the collar of his shirt, a habit he'd never outgrown from childhood, and the hesitant glance he threw back before finally crossing the threshold. The sound of the door closing was soft, but it echoed loudly in Maggie's ears, reverberating like a period at the end of another chapter in this journey. Only when the visitation room was completely silent, save for the distant hum of the fluorescent lights, did she allow the smile to fade. The tears she had determinedly held back now slipped silently down her face. Each drop seemed to carry years of sacrifice, of love and silent struggles she had faced to secure her son's future. They weren't tears of regret. Maggie was fully aware of her choices and would never renounce them. They were instead tears of acceptance, as if each one was a release of the burden she carried in her heart. They were the embodiment of the price a mother pays for unconditional love, a love that knows no bounds, that defies rules and conventions, and that had brought her to this place. She quickly dabbed at her eyes with her fingertips and turned her gaze back to the empty table where Ryan had been sitting only minutes before. She could still feel his presence there, in the words they had exchanged, in the energy he had left behind, and it brought her comfort. Even behind bars, Maggie knew her love would continue to sustain him, like invisible roots that never break. The courtroom was even more crowded than Ryan's trial. Journalists clustered at the back, pencils poised to document every moment of the case that had captured the public's attention. A mother who confessed to murder to save her son. Margaret Thompson was ushered in, her prison uniform swapped for a somber orange suit. Her graying hair was neatly combed, and she carried the same upright posture she had in her teaching days. At the prosecution's table, Morrison wasn't there, but his assistant, Amanda Stevens. The young prosecutor had insisted on taking the case, arguing they needed a fresh perspective, someone who could see beyond the initial narrative. She organized her notes methodically, occasionally casting thoughtful glances at the defendant. Ryan occupied the same seat his mother had during his trial. Front row, hands clasped tightly together, eyes fixed on the figure seated at the defense table. Sarah Wells, now defending Maggie, leaned over to whisper something to her client. Maggie nodded slightly, her eyes meeting her son's for a brief moment. Judge Peterson, not Howard, who had recused himself due to his involvement in the previous case, entered the courtroom. Younger than his predecessor, he carried a reputation for striking a balance between justice and compassion. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the sound of dozens of people standing echoed through the room. Case number 2547, State versus Margaret Thompson. The judge began, his voice clear and precise. Charge of murder in the first degree. He paused, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed those present. Given the unique nature of this case and its extraordinary circumstances, I expect all parties to maintain proper decorum. Amanda Stevens rose, her heels clicking on the silent floor. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her tone carrying a note of solemnity, "the state recognizes the singular complexity of this case. The defendant has confessed to the murder of Thomas Kane, not out of malice or common premeditation, but for a motive that forces us to examine the very limits of justice and morality." In the jury box, 12 faces watched intently, 6 men and 6 women, 4 of them parents. Chen had been meticulous in her selection, seeking a balance between those who might understand the maternal instinct and those who would focus on the letter of the law. Ryan Thompson took the witness stand, nervously adjusting his tie. His gaze met his mother's briefly before settling on Sarah Wells, who rose to begin the questioning. The silence in the courtroom was palpable. Everyone attuned to the man who had been freed only to see his mother take his place in the defendant's chair. "Professor Thompson," Sarah began, her voice gentle yet professional, "can you walk us through the events that preceded Professor Kane's death?" Ryan took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. "I started noticing disturbing patterns in Professor Kane's behavior with some female students. Small gestures, inappropriate comments, situations that made me uncomfortable. If I had acted sooner, reported him formally," his voice faltered, "maybe none of this would have happened." "Objection, Your Honor," Amanda Stevens interjected. "The witness is speculating." "Sustained," Judge Peterson replied. "Continue, Mr. Thompson, but stick to the facts." Ryan straightened, looking directly at the jury. "Kane started subtly threatening me. Hints about my continued employment at the university, comments about how promising careers could be easily destroyed." He paused, swallowing hard. "I should have told my mother. I should have shared my fears, my suspicions. Instead, I tried to protect her, keep her away from all of it." Sarah approached the stand. "And when you discovered your mother was involved?" "I saw her that night," Ryan replied, his voice shaking slightly. "In the parking lot of Kane's building, wearing my coat. I could have stopped it. I could have intervened. But I froze, watching as my mother entered that building to protect me from something I should have faced myself." In the defendant's box, Maggie shook her head imperceptibly, silent tears rolling down her face. Ryan continued, his voice gaining strength. "When she came out, I knew something terrible had happened, but even then, even knowing, I chose to remain silent. I let them arrest me, let them build a case against me because the alternative was to betray my own mother." "Why didn't you say anything during your trial?" Sarah asked. "Because I understood what she had done for me. Kane wasn't just threatening my job. He had built an entire dossier of false allegations, manipulated evidence, coached witnesses. My mother uncovered all of that before I did. She saw the destruction coming and acted to protect me." Ryan looked directly at his mother. "I should have been stronger. I should have confronted Kane openly, exposed his manipulations before it escalated to this point." Amanda Stevens rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Thompson, are you attempting to take blame for a murder you didn't commit?" "I'm saying my actions, or rather my inaction, contributed to this tragedy. If I had been braver, more direct, my mother would never have found herself in that situation. Kane's blood is on my hands too." "Objection," Sarah interjected. "The witness is self-incriminating." "Sustained," the judge replied. "The jury will disregard Mr. Thompson's last statement." Ryan leaned forward, his voice heavy with restrained emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm not here to justify a murder. I'm here to show that the circumstances leading to Thomas Kane's death were created by many people, myself included. My mother is not a cold-blooded killer. She's a woman who found herself backed into a corner, trying to protect her son from calculated and inevitable destruction." On the jury bench, Patricia Martinez, a mother of 3, discreetly wiped her eyes after Ryan's testimony. Beside her, Michael Miller, a middle-aged executive, scribbled intently on his notepad, occasionally nodding and understanding. The atmosphere in the courtroom had subtly shifted. Where there had once been judgment, now a silent empathy hung in the air. During the break, the jurors gathered in the designated room, maintaining official decorum, but their expressions and gestures revealed the impact of the revelations. Susan O'Brien, a retired teacher, was the first to break the protocolary silence. "Did you see her eyes when her son was speaking? That look. It's the same one I gave my son when he was going through a hard time." "The evidence against Kane is disturbing," commented James Wilson, an accountant adjusting his glasses. "A calculated predator using his position to threaten and manipulate. And that dossier he prepared. He was systematically destroying an innocent man's life." A younger juror, Sarah Peterson, who had initially seemed the most skeptical, now showed signs of changing. "We're not here to judge whether Kane deserved to die," she said hesitantly. "But when I think about someone threatening to destroy my family with lies, how much desperation that mother must have felt." Back in the courtroom, the jurors observed Maggie with new eyes. She maintained her serene dignity. But now they saw beyond the accused. They saw a dedicated educator, a protective mother, a woman who had done the unthinkable not out of malice, but out of a devastating love. Robert Green, a father of 2 teenage daughters, found himself studying Maggie's hands. Hands that had graded schoolwork for decades, tended rose bushes, and, in one desperate moment, gripped a lethal weapon. He thought of his own daughters, of what he would do to protect them. During the following testimony, a forensic psychology expert explained the concepts of crime of passion and necessity. But the jurors were already beyond the legal definitions. They observed the silent interaction between mother and son, the shared looks, the mutual concern, the weight of the sacrifice they bore together. Maria Gonzalez, juror number 8, shifted in her seat, studying Maggie with a more attentive gaze. As the closing arguments still echoed in her mind, she couldn't avert her focus from that small gesture. Maggie adjusting her son's collar. It wasn't something rehearsed or part of a strategy to garner sympathy. It was pure, instinctive, a reflex of decades of maternal care that no situation could erase. It was a simple gesture, yet simultaneously laden with meaning. It was as if, in that tiny movement, all of Maggie's love, protection, and concern manifested tangibly. Maria looked around the courtroom, where other jurors seemed absorbed in their own thoughts. But for her, that detail had crystallized something essential about Maggie. This woman before them was no ordinary criminal. She wasn't someone driven by greed or anger, but a mother who had crossed every conceivable line, sacrificing everything she had to protect her son. Maria knew that kind of love well, the kind that doesn't ask for explanations, that doesn't concern itself with consequences, but acts because it must, because it's the only thing to do. She remembered her own mother, a strong woman who, even in the direst circumstances, found ways to demonstrate care. Maria could almost feel her mother's touch smoothing her hair before a school performance, or the swift gesture of wiping a stain from her clothing with a damp cloth. Those moments became etched, even when the words were forgotten. As she watched Maggie, straightening her posture in the defendant's chair, Maria felt something shift within her. There was a clarity now that was impossible to ignore. Maggie didn't act out of malice, but out of love. And though her actions had crossed the boundaries of the law, there was no denying the humanity that permeated every decision. Sarah Wells rose for her closing argument, her gaze sweeping across every face on the jury before she began. Ladies and gentlemen, the case we examine today transcends common definitions of crime and punishment. We are not judging merely an act of violence, but an act of love taken to the extreme. She walked until she stood beside Maggie, who kept her hands folded in her lap, her face serene despite the tension in the air. Margaret Thompson dedicated her entire life to education, shaping young minds, upholding moral values. For 30 years, she taught her students about right and wrong. Then, in one night, she was forced to choose between her moral convictions and the protection of her son. The evidence is clear. Thomas Kane was not merely an abstract threat. He had meticulously constructed a plan to destroy Ryan Thompson, falsified documents, manipulated testimonies, fabricated accusations, a web of lies that would dismantle not only an innocent man's career, but his entire life. Moving closer to the jury box, Wells continued, "Imagine a mother's desperation upon discovering her son is about to be destroyed by calculated lies. Imagine the weight of that revelation on the shoulders of someone who has devoted her life to teaching truth." Margaret Thompson did not seek violence. Violence found her in the form of a predator threatening everything she loved most. The state argues there were other paths, legal alternatives, but Kane had already demonstrated his ability to manipulate the system. His previous victims, silenced by fear and shame, are testament to his power of destruction. Margaret Thompson saw the future that awaited her son, a future of accusations impossible to refute, of doubts that would never be fully dispelled. Turning to the jury, her voice carried restrained emotion. "I am not asking you to ignore the law. I am asking you to see the full truth. A mother who, faced with the imminent destruction of her son, acted not with malicious premeditation, but with the primal desperation of maternal protection. She did not seek this confrontation. She was forced into it by a system that would fail to protect her son. Margaret Thompson confessed voluntarily, preserved evidence of her act, accepted the consequences to save her son. Every action of hers, before and after that fateful night, demonstrates not a criminal but a mother who did the unthinkable when all alternatives were exhausted. In the deliberation room, 12 people bore the weight of a decision that would forever change Maggie Thompson's life. Patricia Martinez, juror number 3, spread her notes across the central table. "We need to consider all mitigating factors," she began. "First, the lack of criminal record. 30 years as an educator, dozens of letters from former students attesting to her character. But it's still homicide," argued James Wilson, juror number 5, adjusting his glasses. "The law is clear about taking a human life." He consulted his own notes. "However, there is the factor of imminent threat." Kane had prepared a full dossier of false accusations. It was not an abstract threat. Sarah Peterson, the youngest juror who initially leaned toward maximum conviction, now presented a different view. The evidence shows Kane was a systematic predator. He manipulated, threatened, destroyed lives. The testimony of the students was devastating. How many careers had he already ruined before? "The question is not whether Kane deserved to die," interjected Robert Green, a middle-aged businessman. It's whether we can consider the extraordinary circumstances that led to this outcome. Even the prosecution admitted this is not a common case of homicide. Maria Gonzalez, a teacher like Maggie, wiped away tears before speaking. Did you see the evidence she preserved? She didn't destroy anything. She kept everything intact, knowing one day she would need to prove the truth. This is not the behavior of a common murderer. And the son? Questioned Susan O'Brien. Ryan Thompson lost months of his life in prison because she waited for the right moment to confess. What kind of cold-blooded killer would do that? Let her own son be accused to ensure that when she confessed, she'd have proof of every word. The discussion continued for hours, each juror bringing their perspective. They analyzed the physical evidence, the emotional testimonies, the psychological reports. Kane's history emerged as a crucial factor. His years of manipulation and abuse of power, the lives he had destroyed through false accusations and veiled threats. There's also the matter of remorse, observed Michael Miller. Not for the act itself. She made it clear she would do it again to protect her son, but for the impact of her actions, the way she turned herself in, the way she accepted the consequences. Jennifer Adams, a mother of 2 teenagers who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. You know what impressed me? The rose garden. Even after the crime, she kept tending to those flowers. She kept teaching. She kept being the same dedicated, caring person. It's not the profile of someone consumed by violence. The debate had turned to sentencing options. First-degree murder seemed excessively severe given the circumstances. The premeditation, though present in the way she donned her son's coat, was born of desperation, not malice. What if we consider manslaughter? Patricia suggested. The law recognizes states of extreme emotion. What could be more extreme than a mother seeing her son's imminent destruction? Kane gave her an impossible choice, Robert reflected. Watch her son's calculated destruction or take drastic action to prevent it. I'm not saying she chose right, but I understand why she chose as she did. After 2 more hours of intensive discussion, a consensus began to form. They couldn't ignore that a life had been taken, but they also couldn't disregard the extraordinary circumstances that led to that fateful night. Maggie Thompson's story was not just about a crime. It was about maternal love taken to the extreme, about impossible choices in desperate situations. The courtroom was completely silent when the jury returned after 12 hours of deliberation. Maggie Thompson remained upright in her chair, her hands only slightly trembling on the table. Ryan in the front row leaned forward, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. Have the members of the jury reached a verdict? Judge Peterson asked, his voice echoing through the hushed room. Patricia Martinez, as the jury's foreperson, rose. The paper in her hands shook slightly. Yes, Your Honor. In the case of the state versus Margaret Thompson, what is the jury's verdict? Patricia took a deep breath before speaking. As to the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. A murmur ran through the room. As to the charge of manslaughter by extreme emotional disturbance, we find the defendant guilty. The sound of Ryan releasing the breath he'd been holding was audible in the silence that followed. Maggie briefly closed her eyes, a single tear trailing down her cheek. Sarah Wells placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Does the jury wish to make a sentencing recommendation? The judge asked. Patricia nodded, her voice stronger now. Yes, Your Honor. Given the extraordinary circumstances of the case, the defendant's exemplary record, and her voluntary confession, we recommend the minimum sentence allowed by law. The din in the courtroom rose. Journalists rushed to scribble notes. Photographers' cameras flashed. Judge Peterson banged his gavel, restoring order. Margaret Thompson, please rise. Maggie rose with dignity, her back straight, her gaze meeting the judge's without hesitation. The jury has found you guilty of manslaughter. Before I pronounce sentence, do you wish to say anything? Only that I accept the verdict with the same conviction with which I accepted my duty to protect my son, Maggie replied, her voice clear and firm, and that I would do it all again if necessary. As the judge prepared to announce the sentence, Ryan Thompson abruptly rose, tears streaming freely down his face. His mother turned to him, and in that exchanged look was the entire story of love, sacrifice, and protection that had brought them to this moment. Judge Peterson adjusted his glasses, studying the document in front of him closely. The courtroom was so silent, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Maggie Thompson remained standing, her hands now relaxed at her sides, as if she had made peace with whatever fate awaited her. "Margaret Thompson," the judge began, his voice carrying a tone few had heard before, "this court has faced a singular dilemma. The law is clear about the act of taking a human life, but it also recognizes that there are circumstances that transcend common definitions of crime and punishment." He paused, removing his glasses. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely encountered a case that so clearly demonstrated the conflict between the letter of the law and its spirit. You confessed to, and were proven the perpetrator of a homicide. Yet the circumstances that led to that act demand special consideration." Ryan gripped the arm of his chair so hard his knuckles were white. Sarah Wells maintained a neutral expression, but her eyes shone with anticipation. "This court cannot ignore your 30-year record of dedicated teaching, the dozens of letters of support from former students and colleagues, your vital role in the community. Nor can we ignore that your voluntary confession freed an innocent, even if that innocent was your own son." The judge picked up another document. "The psychological evaluation indicates no danger." The prosecution acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances. The jury recommended leniency. He looked directly at Maggie. "The law allows me, in exceptional cases, to consider significant mitigating factors." A whisper of anticipation ran through the courtroom. The judge continued, "Considering all factors presented, this court sentences Margaret Thompson to 5 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 2 years, followed by 3 years of supervised release." The din in the room rose. 5 years, far less than the expected 15 to 20. Ryan let out an audible sob of relief. Maggie remained motionless, only the slightest trembling of her lips betraying her emotion. "Furthermore," the judge went on, adjusting his glasses and casting a contemplative look at Maggie, "I recommend that the sentence be served at a minimum security facility with eligibility for prison library work and participation in educational programs." His voice carried a tone of balance, an attempt to convey firmness and compassion at once. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room before proceeding. "The court recognizes that no sentence can truly do justice to the complexity of this case. Ms. Miles Thompson, your action was a crime by the standards of the law, but your motivations and subsequent conduct display a character that merits special consideration." The judge's words hovered in the courtroom like a breeze that interrupts a muffled silence. Maggie remained upright in her chair, her eyes fixed on the magistrate as she absorbed each sentence. For an instant, it seemed that time had stopped. The room, previously so charged with tension, now seemed to vibrate with a mix of relief and reflection. The jurors exchanged discreet glances, some nodding slightly, as if confirming to themselves that this decision was the fairest possible. In the front row, Ryan felt a lump in his throat that prevented him from breathing fully. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the judge's words to repeat in his mind, "Character deserving of special consideration." That phrase echoed like a validation, not only of his mother's sacrifice, but also of the humanity she maintained, even in the face of impossible choices. He wiped away a tear that escaped without asking permission and opened his eyes to observe his mother, whose posture remained firm, but whose gaze reflected a mix of relief and acceptance. The prosecutor, seated at her table, leaned forward slightly, as if considering an objection, but withdrew upon realizing the impact the judge's words had had on the room. It was not just a judicial decision. It was a demonstration that sometimes the law needed to be interpreted with a more human eye, considering the nuances of each case. Maggie finally let out a small sigh. It was as if all the tension accumulated over months of trial began to dissipate. She clasped her hands in her lap, feeling the cool of the wooden table against her skin, and responded to the judge with a slight nod of her head in a sign of respect. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice low but firm. "I accept the sentence with full awareness of what I did and what I still need to do to move forward. I appreciate you considering the circumstances." The judge leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you take advantage of the opportunities that will be given to you during the serving of your sentence. What you did cannot be undone, but the positive impact you can continue to have on the lives of others is still significant." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "The court believes you still have much to offer, even in adverse circumstances. May your experience be a lesson, not only for this court, but for all who know you." The room remained silent as the judge leaned back in his chair and looked at the clerk, signaling that the formalities of the case were concluded. The sound of the gavel striking the wood brought everyone back to reality. Maggie rose slowly, accompanied by her attorney Sarah Wells, who gave her a look of silent support. As she was led out, Maggie held her head high and looked at Ryan, who remained in the front row, his eyes fixed on his mother. The exchange of glances between them was laden with emotions that words could not express. Gratitude, love, and a silent promise that this chapter would not be the end, but a new beginning, despite the adversities. The murmur in the room began to grow as people stood up. Some journalists frantically jotted down the last details, while others exchanged comments about the unusual sentence. In the courthouse hallways, faces reflected something rare in trial cases. Not just a sense of justice, but of humanity. Maggie Thompson was not just another defendant. She had become a symbol of sacrifice and maternal love. As Maggie crossed the corridor that would lead her to the next chapter of her journey, a ray of light pierced the high, narrow courthouse window, bathing her in an unexpected glow. It was a subtle reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, there would always be room for light to find its way. The courthouse's private visiting room had been granted for one last moment between Maggie and Ryan before her transfer. Mother and son sat facing each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. The afternoon sun streamed through the barred window, casting dancing shadows on the grey walls. 5 years, Ryan murmured, his voice choked. "It's far less than we feared, Mother." He reached across the table, touching her fingers lightly, "and with good behavior in 2 years." 2 years, Maggie completed, a soft smile on her lips. "Enough time for you to reorganize the garden. The roses will need pruning in the spring, don't forget, and the lilies need partial shade." "Mom," Ryan interrupted, tears streaming down his face, "how can you think about flowers at a time like this?" Maggie squeezed her son's hand. "Because life goes on, Ryan. The flowers will keep blooming, the seasons will pass, and you need to move forward. Promise you'll go back to teaching." "I already promised," he answered, his voice breaking. "The university offered me my position back, with a formal apology." He hesitated. "But I don't know if I can go back there knowing—" "You will go back," Maggie stated firmly. "You'll go back because you're an excellent teacher, because your students need you, and because we can't let Kane win even now." She straightened in her chair, instinctively assuming her teacher's stance. "Life is about choices, son. I've made mine, now it's your turn to make yours." A guard knocked on the door, signaling that time was running out. Ryan abruptly stood up, circling the table to embrace his mother. Maggie enveloped him in her arms as she did when he was a child, feeling his body tremble with suppressed sobs. "Forgive me, Mother," he whispered against her hair, "for not being strong enough, for letting it come to this." "There is nothing to forgive," she answered softly, pulling back to hold his face between her hands. "You are my son, my only son. Everything I did out of love, and I'd do it all over again." "I'll visit you every week," Ryan promised. "I'll bring pictures of the garden, news of your former students. And I want to know everything," Maggie smiled, automatically adjusting the collar of his shirt. "So your classes, your students, that girl from the library you think I haven't noticed you're interested in." Ryan blushed slightly, letting out a tearful laugh. "How do you always know everything?" "I'm your mother," she answered simply. "It's my job to know." The guard knocked again. "Now go, and Ryan." She held his face between her hands one last time. "Live, be happy. It's all I've ever wanted for you." When the door closed behind Ryan, the sound echoed in the visiting room like the final toll of a distant bell. Maggie remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the door he had just exited, as if she could prolong the moment, store every second of that farewell in her memory. Her hand was still outstretched on the cold metal table, where she had held Ryan's moments before. It was only when the silence enveloped the room that she finally allowed a single tear to roll down her face, warm against the cold skin of her cheek. 5 years, she thought, as she tilted her head back and let out a deep sigh. The plain white ceiling of the room seemed farther away than ever, as if the weight of her new reality pushed it away. 5 years. It was enough time for so many things. Enough time for her garden to bloom again, every rose and lily coming back to life under Ryan's careful hands. She could picture him in the garden, kneeling in the soft soil, his hands soiled with earth, just as she used to do. The vision made her smile softly, a smile laden with an almost palpable hope. Her gaze turned to the narrow barred window where a piece of blue sky was visible like a glimpse of the world outside. The afternoon sun streamed through the bars, casting delicate shadows that moved slowly across the floor. Maggie allowed her mind to wander, traveling to a future where the bars would no longer be a barrier between her and her son. A future where she could once again walk in her garden, breathing in the scent of newly bloomed flowers and hearing Ryan's laughter echoing through the yard. But it wasn't just the garden that would bloom in those 5 years. Maggie knew the time would also be Ryan's ally in rebuilding his life, solidifying his dreams, and achieving the happiness she had fought so hard to protect. She thought of Claire, of the promise of a wedding that awaited when her sentence ended. She pictured the ceremony, the smiling faces of Ryan and Claire, the sound of laughter and music filling the air. And at the center of it all, she would be there, holding their hands with the same pride she had always felt for her son. Maggie closed her eyes for a moment, allowing memories and hopes to mingle in her mind. Her heart, though heavy with the price she had paid, was filled with an unexpected tranquility. Even within the confines of prison, love remained a force that transcended physical barriers. It was like an underground river, flowing silently, nourishing everything around it. The door to the visitors' room opened again, and a guard entered to escort her back to her cell. Maggie rose slowly, her movements calm yet steady. As she walked through the narrow, cold corridors, the walls seemed less suffocating. In her mind, she held the image of Ryan smiling, Claire by his side, a future full of possibilities. 5 years would not be merely a sentence. They would be a period of transformation, of growth, for both her and the child. When she finally reached her cell, Maggie sat on the narrow bed and looked out the window once more. The shadows of the bars projected onto the floor, but she did not focus on them. Instead, she focused on the light passing between the bars, the golden rays touching her hands. Love, she murmured to herself, is stronger than any bars. And with that, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine the life that awaited her on the other side. The news of Maggie Thompson's sentencing spread quickly through the academic community. The university campus, once divided by tragedy, now united in a wave of collective reflection. Former students of Maggie's organized a vigil in the university gardens, lighting candles among the flowers she had loved so much. Emily Parker, the student who had first brought forth the evidence against Kane, started a support group for student victims of harassment. Mrs. Thompson's courage has opened doors that have been locked for years, she declared during a meeting. Other victims are finally finding their voice to tell their stories. In the faculty lounge, the case prompted structural changes. The university implemented new reporting and protection protocols, ensuring that no other predator could use the system against their victims. Kane's legacy was being dismantled, revealing a web of manipulation that stretched back years. Ryan watched these changes with a mix of pride and sadness. His first classes after returning were marked by a silent yet profound support. Students and colleagues demonstrated their solidarity through small gestures: a coffee cup left on his desk, a rose placed on his door, kind words whispered in the hallways. Maggie's garden became an involuntary symbol. Neighbors and former students took turns maintaining it, ensuring the flowers continued to bloom in her absence. "It's the least we can do," an elderly neighbor explained, watering the roses. She protected not only her child, but all the future victims Kane might have made. The legal community was also impacted. The Thompson case became a reference point in discussions about restorative justice and mitigating circumstances. Sarah Wells received invitations to lecture on the case at law schools, where Maggie's story sparked heated debates about the boundaries between justice and morality. But perhaps the deepest impact was on the families within the community. Stories about Maggie Thompson began to be shared at family dinners, neighborhood gatherings, and school meetings, sparking reflections many had avoided for years. Parents, who previously felt disconnected from the emotional and social challenges their children faced, began to pay closer attention to the signs, the nuances of their behavior. These were not just cautionary tales, but also stories of inspiration. Maggie, despite the circumstances, had become a symbol of strength and unconditional love. In a living room lit by the warm glow of an antique lamp, Maria Lopez, mother of 2 teenagers, sat beside her eldest daughter, Isabella, who had just returned from a protest against school bullying. "You know, Hija," Maria began, her voice hesitant, "when I heard this woman's story, this mother's, something changed inside me." She held her daughter's hands, feeling the texture of the calluses that came from the afternoons Isabella spent training for the volleyball championship. "I realized that even with the best intentions, we sometimes fail to protect those we love most. I want you to know I'm here to listen, always, even if it's difficult, even if it's uncomfortable. I want you to tell me everything." Isabella remained silent for a few seconds, her gaze fixed on her mother's eyes. "Thank you, Mum," she replied, her voice low but laden with emotion. "There are things I've always wanted to say, but I didn't know if you would understand." The conversation unfolded for hours, as Maria listened intently to details she had never imagined about her daughter's routine, the challenges at school, the pressures to fit in. It was as if a portal of communication had suddenly opened between them. Next door, Jorge Martinez, a single father to a 10-year-old boy, was sitting on the living room floor with his son Miguel. The little boy held an action figure as he explained how he had protected a classmate who was being bullied. "I told them he was my friend," Miguel recounted, his eyes shining with pride. Jorge smiled, but there was a seriousness in his tone when he replied, "And you did the right thing, son, but if anything ever bothers you, or if you need help, I want you to know you can talk to me, no matter what it is." He leaned down to meet the boy's eye level. "I'm your dad, and like this mother in the story we heard, I would do anything to protect you." These moments of connection began to spread throughout the community. Support groups emerged in local schools, led by teachers inspired by Maggie's courage. In one such group, teacher Ana Mendez organized discussion circles between parents and students. Her previously silent room soon filled with voices that were once afraid to speak up. "I never knew how to approach my mom about the things that bothered me," admitted Clara, a shy 14-year-old student. Her mother, seated beside her, squeezed her hand. "And I never knew how to ask because I was always afraid of being intrusive," she responded. The circle became a place where both could speak without fear of judgment. Beyond intimate conversations, Maggie's sacrifice also spurred practical changes. School counselors began implementing parent training workshops, covering topics like open communication and identifying signs of abuse. At the local library, a special section was created with books on maternal love, resilience, and social justice, with a discreet plaque that read, "In memory of the sacrifice for a better future." And as families began to reflect and change, a universal understanding emerged. The instinct to protect those we love is a thread that connects us as humans. Maggie Thompson was not just a mother. She was a reflection of what many would do if placed in extreme situations. Her actions forced people to confront issues they had long avoided, allowing the seeds of a new empathy to germinate in soil that once seemed infertile. Every Sunday at 10 o'clock in the morning, Ryan Thompson crossed through the gates of the Women's State Prison. 6 months had passed since the sentencing, and his Sunday routine was as precise as clockwork. He always brought a briefcase with photos of the garden, his students' work, and news he knew would interest his mother. Maggie had established her own routine in prison. She worked in the library, organizing books and occasionally helping other inmates with basic studies. Her orange uniform was always impeccably clean, and she maintained the same careful hairstyle from her teaching days. "The white roses bloomed this week," Ryan said, sliding a photograph across the visitors' table. "Just like you said they would." Maggie smiled, touching the photo with her fingertips. Her eyes shone as she saw her garden so lovingly maintained. "And how are the classes going?" she asked, naturally assuming her educator's stance. The prison library served as her new domain, where she continued to exercise her teaching vocation, now helping inmates earn their diplomas. "I went back to teaching full-time," Ryan responded, watching pride beam in his mother's eyes. "The students, they've been incredible, Mum. so understanding, so supportive. He paused, taking more papers from his briefcase. I brought something for you to see. It was a petition from the students, requesting that the university name the new anti-harassment policy in honor of Maggie Thompson. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the document. They understand, she said softly. They understand that sometimes we need to fight the system to change it. The weekly visits became a ritual of healing for them both. Ryan shared his small victories, a student overcoming difficulties, a new successful teaching technique, the garden blooming in new colors. Maggie in turn spoke of the books she organized, the women she helped study, the small ways she found to make a difference even behind bars. I met someone, Ryan admitted during a visit, blushing slightly. Claire, the librarian I mentioned. Maggie smiled, that motherly smile that knew all the secrets even before they were revealed. She's been a great help to me these past few months, organizing reading events for underprivileged children. Bring her next Sunday, Maggie replied, her eyes shining with a mixture of curiosity and genuine joy. She tilted her head slightly, as she did when she wanted to capture every detail of something that brought her happiness. I want to meet the lady who's making my son smile again. The soft morning light streamed through the barred windows, casting a golden glow that reflected off her graying hair. Even there, separated from the world by walls and constant surveillance, Maggie was, above all, a mother. Her love and concern for her son transcended the barriers that separated them from the rest of the world. Ryan gave a shy smile, his cheeks slightly flushed. He fiddled with the hem of his shirt as he did when he was a child, a habit Maggie immediately recognized. Claire has talked so much about you, he confessed, his voice laden with tenderness. She's nervous, you know. She said she wants to make a good impression. She's choosing her words carefully, thinking about what to wear. I think she respects you more than she does me. He laughed, but there was a tone of admiration in his voice. Maggie let out a low chuckle that contained laughter that came from the depths of her soul, yet maintained her serene composure. If Claire is worried about making a good impression, it's because she's already special. Women who have that kind of concern, Ryan, usually carry a quiet strength and a genuine heart. And that, my son, is all I could ask for in someone who has chosen to walk by your side. Ryan leaned forward on the narrow table in the visitor's room, his elbows resting on the cold metal. I just hope she sees what I see in you, Mom, he said, his voice catching. I want her to understand the strength you have, everything you've done for me, everything you still do even from in here. Maggie looked deeply into her son's eyes, her expression softening with a love that seemed to fill the entire room. Ah, Ryan, she began, reaching out to hold his hand. What I am is simple, a mother. Just a mother who would do anything for her son. And Claire, if she's the woman you describe, already understands that, even without knowing me yet. She sees in you everything that I see, and that's enough for me. From the other side of the room, the muffled sound of conversations between other inmates and visitors created a soft symphony. But Maggie and Ryan seemed to be in a world of their own. A world where only they existed, where time seemed to slow down so they could savor that moment. I remember, Maggie said suddenly, her voice laden with nostalgia, when you brought your first girlfriend home. What was her name? Anna? She was so nervous that she spilled her juice on the dining room table. She laughed softly, the sound filled with wistfulness. And you, trying to impress her, said you'd clean it all up yourself, but ended up making more of a mess. Ryan let out an open laugh, the first genuinely carefree one in a long time. Anna, he confirmed, shaking his head. Oh, Mom, she never stood a chance with you. You knew from the start it wasn't going to work out. I knew because you didn't smile the way you're smiling now, Maggie responded, her voice gentle but firm. With Claire, you have that light in your eyes that I haven't seen in years. It's like something has been reignited inside you again. That's what I'm talking about, Ryan. That's what I see. The nearby guard cleared his throat softly, a subtle reminder that visiting time was nearing its end. Ryan looked at the watch on his wrist and sighed. It always seems like time flies when we're here, Mum, he said, his voice full of melancholy. But I promise that next Sunday I'll bring Claire. She's also eager to meet you. I'll be waiting, Maggie replied, with a reassuring smile. And tell her she doesn't need to worry about making a good impression. The simple fact that she makes you happy is all that matters to me. She squeezed his hand again, firmly, as if she wanted to convey all her confidence and love in a single gesture. As Ryan prepared to say goodbye, Maggie watched him, recording every detail: the way he adjusted the collar of his shirt, the way he still ran his fingers through his hair when he was nervous. Even separated by such difficult circumstances, that moment carried the promise of something more, a future where the bars would no longer be a barrier, where her son's happiness would be her own. When Ryan finally walked away, casting one last look at his mother before leaving the room, Maggie remained seated, the smile still etched on her face. Ryan's happiness, even if still a work in progress, was like a ray of sunshine piercing through the clouds of prison. And even there, amid the shadows, she knew that love had a way of growing, of illuminating, of transforming everything around it. A year had passed. In the prison library, Maggie coordinated a literacy program she had created herself. Her students, women who had never had the opportunity to study, were now discovering the power of words under her patient guidance. The once quiet and underutilized space vibrated with the energy of learning. "Mrs. Thompson," called Maria, a 40-year-old inmate who could barely write her name when she arrived, "I managed to read an entire book on my own." Her eyes shone with the same pride Maggie had seen in hundreds of students throughout her career. Some bars could not contain the power of education. Outside, Ryan was flourishing on his own journey of rebuilding. His physical education classes had transformed. Now, in addition to traditional exercises, he incorporated discussions about respect, consent, and the importance of standing up for what's right. His students saw him not only as a teacher, but as an example of resilience. Claire, the librarian, had become a constant presence in his life. Together, they created a university outreach program focused on harassment prevention and empowerment through education. The program, inspired by Maggie's story, had already reached dozens of schools in the region. In prison, Maggie turned a small patch in the yard into a community garden. "The flowers remind us that there is still beauty in the world," she explained to the other inmates, teaching them to cultivate not only plants, but hope. The project became so successful that the prison administration expanded the area, allowing more inmates to participate. Ryan kept the family's home garden immaculate, following his mother's detailed instructions in her letters to the letter. Every flower that bloomed was photographed and shared during their weekly visits. The garden became a symbol of continuity, of life that persists despite adversity. "I'm proud of you," Maggie said during a visit, looking at photos of her son receiving an Excellence in Teaching award. Ryan had been recognized for his work in transforming the campus culture. "You not only survived, you are making a difference." Both their lives found new rhythms, new purposes. Maggie discovered that even in prison she could continue her vocation as an educator. Her classes in the library became legendary, with a waiting list of inmates eager to learn. The administration noticed a drop in violence rates among participants in her programs. Ryan, in turn, found the strength to transform trauma into positive action. With Claire, he was planning a support center for victims of institutional harassment. The name? The Maggie Thompson Project. Education as Liberation. When he told his mother about the project, he saw tears of pride in her eyes. "See how everything has a purpose?" Maggie said, holding her son's hand across the visitors' table. "What happened was terrible, but look at how much good is being born from it." She paused, smiling softly. "And is that a new ring on Claire's finger?" Ryan blushed, averting his gaze for a moment, but a shy smile soon curved his lips. "I was going to tell you today," he said, his voice laden with a mixture of nervousness and genuine joy. "We'll get married when you get out of here. Claire insisted on waiting so you can be present." He raised his eyes to meet his mother's gaze, as if seeking her approval, though he knew she would never disapprove of something that brought him happiness. Maggie, who had long since learned to hide her emotions behind a calm expression, could not contain the wave of joy that swept across her face at that moment. Her fingers tightened around her son's, and she felt as if, for an instant, the world around her became lighter, as if the grey, cold walls of the visitors' room disappeared. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice choked by a lump forming in her throat. "You don't know how happy this makes me." She blinked rapidly to hold back the tears that threatened to fall, but could not stop one from escaping and gently rolling down her cheek. Ryan watched his mother's emotion, feeling his heart warmed by seeing her so genuinely happy. "Claire wanted you to know first," he continued, leaning slightly over the table to shorten the distance between them. "She said there could be no wedding without you there, Mum. She wants you to walk in with us at the church when everything is settled." Maggie let out a short, emotion-filled laugh. "That girl is a treasure," she said, shaking her head with a smile that lit up her face. "Claire has always been sensitive, but this is more than I could ever hope for." She paused, her eyes fixed on Ryan's face, absorbing every detail, as if she wanted to etch that moment into her memory, to revisit it during the long, solitary hours in her cell. "Tell her it's a privilege, a gift. Something I'll count the days until it finally happens." Ryan nodded, grinning widely. "She'll be so happy to hear that." He pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the table between them. "And she asked me to show you this. It's a sketch of the dress she's designing. She said she wants you to see it before anyone else." Maggie took the envelope carefully, as if it contained something precious. Upon opening it and sliding the thin paper out, she saw the delicate sketch of a simple yet elegant wedding dress. Claire's signature was in the bottom corner, and Maggie felt a fresh wave of emotion as she traced her fingers over the image. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her eyes lingering on the details of the drawing. "So delicate, so full of love." She looked at Ryan, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Tell her I loved it. Tell her I can't wait to see her wearing it radiant, on the most important day of both your lives." Maggie took a deep breath, putting the paper back into the envelope and holding it like a treasure. "You two are lucky to have found each other. Don't let anything in this world take that away from you, Ryan." Ryan smiled, leaning over to lightly touch his mother's hand. "We won't, Mom. I promise you. And I promise I'll do everything I can to make the day perfect, so you can be there by my side." He paused, glancing around the room before adding in a lower tone, "This will be our moment. A moment to leave all this behind and celebrate a new beginning." The visitation room was quiet, save for the muffled sound of footsteps and distant murmurs. Maggie looked at the grey walls surrounding them, but in that instant, she didn't feel the weight of prison. Instead, she felt the promise of the future, a future where she would stand beside her son and the woman he loved, celebrating the life and love they had fought for against all odds. Ed with conviction, "I promise I'll be there. And when that day comes, I'll walk you down the aisle with the same pride I felt the day you were born." Ryan smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I couldn't ask for anything better, Mom. Thank you for everything, for never giving up on me." As the guard announced the end of visitation time, Maggie and Ryan remained with their hands clasped, their unspoken emotions conveying all they didn't need to say in words. Even separated by bars and circumstances, the love that bound them continued to overcome any barrier. On the eve of completing her first year in prison, Maggie Thompson sat in her cell, watching the moon through the barred window. In her hands, she held Ryan's last letter, announcing he would be a father. The news that she would become a grandmother brought with it a wave of reflections on the cyclical nature of a mother's love. In her diary, a gift from Ryan on her birthday, she began to write, "A mother's love is a force that transcends conventional morality, defying the laws of men to obey an older, deeper law, the unconditional protection of our children. I do not regret what I did, though I bear the weight of my actions. Cain took many things from me, my freedom, my gardens, my sunny days. But he could not take what mattered most, my son's integrity, his future, his chance at happiness." The diary pages filled with her precise teacher's handwriting. "They say violence begets violence, that justice cannot be built on an act of vengeance. Perhaps they are right. But there are moments when love forces us into impossible choices, moments when we must sacrifice our very souls to save those we love." A tear fell on the paper as she continued, "I will soon be a grandmother. My grandson or granddaughter will be born into a world I hope is a little better thanks to the changes our story sparked. Ryan tells me the anti-harassment program has already helped dozens of people, that other mothers will not have to make the choices I did." The moonlight painted soft shadows in her cell, dancing across the cold concrete walls, and illuminating the contours of Maggie Thompson as she held the diary with trembling hands, as if each written word carried the weight of her soul. Her handwriting, meticulously drawn as in the days when she graded student essays, seemed to vibrate under the silvery glow. Her eyes, misty but fixed on the page, reflected a mix of serenity and sadness, a calm acceptance of what she had done and the consequences she now carried. "A mother's love," she murmured, pausing to absorb the echo of her own words reverberating in the silent cell. Her voice was a whisper, but in that empty space, it seemed to resonate like a mantra. "It is a paradox," she repeated in a lower tone, as if testing the weight of the phrase. Maggie averted her gaze to the small barred window, where the full moon hovered like a silent witness to her reflection. The sky was clear, speckled with stars that seemed to shine more intensely in contrast to the darkness around them. She had always liked nights like this. In times past, she would sit in her garden, a cup of tea between her hands, listening to the soft sound of the wind among the roses. Now her reality was a confined space, surrounded by walls that seemed to absorb all light, but even there she found beauty in the moon rays escaping through the bars. With a deep sigh, she returned to the diary, her fingers gently gliding across the filled pages. "It can create and destroy," she wrote again, reinforcing the sentence. She closed her eyes for a moment and saw herself holding Ryan for the first time at the hospital, wrapped in white blankets, his newborn face wrinkled and eyes closed in deep sleep. She remembered the overpowering force of that moment, a certainty that she would do anything for him. It was a feeling that had never left her, even on the hardest days. Maggie rested her head against the cold wall behind her, letting the diary rest on her lap. "To save and condemn," she whispered to herself, and this time she felt a chill run down her spine. Her mind took her back to that fateful night in Thomas Kane's apartment, where the line between saving and condemning became indistinguishable. Every detail returned with disturbing clarity. The sound of breaking glass, the flickering lamplight, the metallic smell of blood mixed with spilled coffee. She closed her eyes, trying to push the images away, but they insisted on remaining like shadows tattooed in her memory. "It is a force that allows us to endure the unendurable," she said aloud, as if she wanted to reaffirm this truth to herself. Her thoughts turned to Ryan, to his desperate look in court, begging her not to take the blame. The words he had said at that moment echoed in her mind. "I cannot let you do this, Mom." But she knew, with the same certainty she had always had since the moment he was born, that there was no choice. Not for her. Tears began streaming down her face, silent and warm, falling on the rough fabric of her prison clothes. "I do not ask for understanding or forgiveness for what I did," she murmured again, now with a choked voice. She knew many would judge her, that perhaps they would never understand the depth of her motivations. Yet at that moment, she did not seek redemption. What she sought was something more intimate, more visceral, the certainty that, despite everything, she had fulfilled her duty as a mother. She reached out to the barred window, as if she could touch the moon with her fingers. The silvery light reflected on her skin, and Maggie smiled softly, a smile laden with a quiet strength. When a mother is forced to choose between the law of men and the protection of her child, there is truly no choice at all, she concluded, her voice now an almost inaudible whisper. Tucking the diary beside the narrow bed, Maggie lay down, letting the moonlight bathe her face as she closed her eyes. And for the first time in months, she felt a brief moment of peace. The love that had guided her there remained intact, and even through the bars she knew its strength, like the moonlight, would find ways to shine through the darkness. Closing the diary gently, Maggie rested it on the small metal nightstand beside her narrow bed, as if storing a piece of herself. Her fingers lingered on the worn leather cover, tracing the subtle marks that months of use had left there. Each scratch, each crease on the leather's surface was a silent testimony to the lonely nights when she had poured out her thoughts, as if the pages were confidants who would never judge her. There was a strange comfort in that object, a sense that as long as her words remained there, her story would never be forgotten. The night's silence was almost absolute, yet not empty. There was a heavy quality to it, as if the prison walls absorbed the emotions of those who inhabited that space. The occasional sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, the cadenced rhythm of the guards on their rounds, mingling with the low, steady hum of the fluorescent lights. Maggie, however, had learned to find a strange peace in those monotonous sounds. They were a reminder that even in that cold and controlled environment, life still pulsed around her. She took a deep breath, letting the sterile, cold air fill her lungs. The peculiar smell of the prison, a mix of metal, cheap cleaning products, and something she could only describe as arrested time, seemed less oppressive that night. Her eyes slowly rose to the barred window, where a rectangle of starry sky was visible. The moonlight crept in shyly, casting a silvery glow on the concrete floor and reflecting off the iron bars. Maggie focused on that sliver of sky, as if she could see beyond it, to a world where physical boundaries did not exist and freedom was more than a concept. In that moment, she found something akin to serenity. The solitary moon shining above it all seemed a silent reminder that even in darkness there was beauty, and somehow that was enough to help her face another night. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting a silvery light that flooded the cell with a soft, melancholic glow. Maggie watched the rays filtering through the bars, casting shadows on the worn concrete floor, creating a mosaic of light and darkness that seemed to mirror her own journey. The cramped space around her faded for an instant, replaced by memories of nights in her garden, where the flowers captured that same lunar radiance, transforming into a spectacle of soft, vibrant colors. It was hard to imagine that outside those walls the world kept moving, flowers blooming, children running through parks, windows illuminated by life going on. For a moment, Maggie closed her eyes and allowed herself to imagine what Ryan might be doing at that exact instant. Perhaps he was sitting in his living room, reviewing garden plans for the next season, as they had so often done together before everything changed. Or maybe he was reading a story to Claire, his life partner, with a forgotten cup of tea beside him. There was something comforting in picturing that, the simplicity of life carrying on, the promise of a renewed future. But what warmed her heart the most was imagining Ryan preparing for the baby's arrival. She could almost see his expression as he assembled the crib in the room that used to be his office, his careful hands adjusting each piece while Claire watched, laughing at his exaggerated seriousness. It was a vision that brought her peace, a reminder that the sacrifice she had made had served its purpose. Her child was safe, free, and building a new life filled with hope and possibilities. As she gazed at the moon, Maggie began to hear a distant conversation between two inmates in the hallway. The voices were muffled, but they carried a familiarity that made this prison feel, in a way, more human, more connected. It wasn't so different from the nights in college when Maggie graded papers and heard the echoes of youthful voices reverberating through the corridors. The difference now was that those voices belonged to women who, like her, carried heavy stories and scars that couldn't be erased. She adjusted herself in the bed, pulling the thin blanket to cover herself. The smell of the fabric washed in cheap products brought with it a momentary feeling of discomfort, but Maggie didn't allow herself to focus on that. Instead, she turned her thoughts to the promise she had made to herself upon entering there, to seize every opportunity to teach, transform, and somehow blossom. Just like the garden she envisioned in her mind, and which was now tended by Ryan, Maggie believed that every person carried the potential to grow and renew themselves, even amidst the most adverse conditions. When the moonlight was finally obscured by passing clouds, Maggie allowed herself to whisper to the empty cell, "You're going to be an excellent father, Ryan, and I'll be here waiting to see you grow even more." Her words were not meant for anyone but herself, but the soft echo that reverberated in the cell seemed to carry them away, as if the universe conspired to ensure that Ryan, wherever he was, could feel them. With one last sigh, she closed her eyes, allowing the serenity of that moment to fill every corner of her mind. The distant sound of footsteps echoing through the prison corridors seemed to dissolve, leaving only the sound of her slow and controlled breathing. Even in the cold silence of her cell, Maggie felt the warmth of something that transcended her circumstances, the certainty that life went on, that she was part of a greater cycle, something that could not be contained by bars or concrete walls. She envisioned Ryan in her mind, as if painting a scene in her imagination. He was in the garden of the house where she had cultivated her flowers for years, the sun hitting his hair and a soft smile on his face as he tended the roses. Maggie could almost smell the petals, mixed with the scent of damp earth and the distant sound of birds singing. This was the world she had helped preserve for him, and it was in it that she found her peace. Despite the limitations of her reality, Maggie knew that true freedom was not only in physical spaces, but in the ability to create meaning, to find purpose, even in the most adverse circumstances. Every letter she received from Ryan, every word of support and affection he wrote, was a reminder that the sacrifice she had made had borne fruit. Ryan was blossoming, finding his happiness, rebuilding his life, and that strengthened her. She slowly opened her eyes, facing the bars illuminated by the moonlight. Even there, where so many saw only darkness, Maggie felt a spark of life pulsing within her. The love she shared with her son was greater than any physical confinement. It was eternal, like the unbreakable cycle of life. Did you like the story of Maggie Thompson and Ryan Thompson? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that is waiting for you here on the screen. I'll be waiting for you there.